Given how much the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the film industry, we are left with many questions for a new year. Are the age of theaters over once and for all? What impact will streaming have on the movie industry? What kind of changes will we see with the HBO Max decision to put their entire 2021 slate onto the streaming service? Gabe will lead our discussion here today to try to answer these in a new episode of I Beg to Differ.
Just to start off with, I'd like to know what each of you guys' favorite shows and movies of 2020 are.
My favorite movie this year was definitely Soul, the new Pixar film that just came out on Disney Plus. I thought that after a whole year of sadness and horrible things that are happening in the world, I think Soul was a beautiful movie to end this year on. And I thought it was an especially powerful story talking about how we should spend our life, how we should view life. And it gave me, after watching that movie, it gave me a whole new worldview. And I think I'll carry that on with me to a new year.
I think I have two favorites, actually. One of my favorites is Mank, the new David Fincher movie that's on Netflix. And I definitely really enjoyed it. It's about Mank, who was it's about the life of Mank, one of the writers of Citizen Kane, and he just kind of goes into his life, how he got to write the script, and really about like his character. And I thought it was just like really amazing, like just like production wise, the cinematography, the music, the acting. Gary Oldman was awesome. The score was amazing. Amanda Seyfried was pretty cool as well. Like really just the acting was incredible. And I really enjoyed it. I'm a big fan of like Citizen Kane, so I just love seeing like the story develop and the history of it. I guess one like warning though is that I definitely don't think it's like accessible to many people, because I feel like you wouldn't enjoy it if you haven't watched Citizen Kane and if you don't even know like the history behind the movie, because the movie just kind of like assumes that you already have some background to it. So I guess that's why I think a lot of people haven't seen it, and definitely like the week that it premiered, it definitely was not supposed to be like a box office hit, but definitely if you're like a big movie nerd, like I definitely think it's like one of the best movies of the year. And it has like a lot of like little references. Obviously it's shot in black and white, just like that. They like do like shots that perfectly mimic the famous shots from Citizen Kane, and it just like you learn a lot from it, who the character was based on. So it's super interesting. But yeah, like this movie was David Fincher, that he loves the story of Citizen Kane. This was not supposed to be like a social network or something. Like it was just something that he wanted to do. And I hope, since like this year with the Oscars, obviously there's not that many movies, he could finally get like Best Director, which would be great. So hopefully the Oscars don't like snub him like for Social Network. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed Mank, but definitely watch Citizen Kane beforehand. I don't think you would enjoy it if you haven't.
Well, I guess my favorite movie released in 2020 is not really a traditional movie, but kind of the film of Hamilton, the play, that was released in 2020, and I really enjoyed that. I was really wanting to watch it earlier, but I wasn't able to, and even now, like I watched it like a few weeks ago, even though it came out in July. So, but it really blew me away. I really understood what all the hype was about, the songs, the rhyming, the acting, everything was just top notch.
Yeah, that was another great release this year. I forgot that came out.
Yeah, I forgot too. That was really awesome when I found out that they were going to do the official release. That way everyone could sort of get to enjoy what only a select few got when it was actually on Broadway. But I guess going on the non-traditional track, my favorite movie this year is an anime movie called Made in Abyss, Dawn of the Deep Soul. I watched it earlier this year. I watched it with Gabe, actually. It was pretty awesome. It's a sequel to an anime called Made in Abyss. And I won't launch into an entire plot synopsis, but if you're a fan of world building or horror stories or like just fantasy in general, I highly recommend it. It's awesome.
I guess I actually had two favorite movies from this year, and one of them is kind of a more non-traditional pick as well. It's Wolfwalkers, and it was released on Apple TV, and it's by the same studio that brought us Secret of Kells in about 2009, I think. And it's like an Irish folklore movie, and hand-drawn animation, which I'm a huge fan of hand-drawn animation, especially anything 2D. And so to have such an incredible film released this year that was hand-drawn animation was super cool. I think it also tackled a lot of issues that a lot of like animated films don't really tackle, like environmentalism, also like feminism. It was such a great movie, and I highly recommend, especially since it's available on streaming. And then also I really enjoyed another film that came out earlier in the year from Eliza Hittman, who did Beach Rats, and it was called Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. And it's just this beautiful kind of neo-realist piece that really focuses on just like kind of capturing real life and just like bringing an authentic story to the screen. And what I also really appreciate about that film is there's a lot of these films that don't really focus on bringing women to like the behind the scenes roles, and this scene or this movie brought a cinematographer, a female cinematographer, Helen LeVar, and used her beautiful cinematography to kind of create this very real portrait of this young girl dealing with like getting an abortion and reproductive rights and all of that. And so it's also a very timely movie, and also just beautifully made. So
That was one of my favorites too. I actually watched it last week and I absolutely loved it. It was such a like a quiet movie, and everything was like for the everything, like all the emotions was just the performances and just like how the actors just like looked, their expressions, how they walked, and it was so like it really like got me. I teared up. Oh my god, it was really good. And the actress, the main actress, I forgot her name. I think it was Sydney
Sydney Flanagan.
Flanagan. Yeah, it was her first role and she was incredible. She's not like, I think she's like a musician, like she's not really an actress. And it was just really, really, really good. And yeah, it was just like super touching. It was super emotional, and I was just gravitated for like beginning to end. And yeah, I'm just super happy that like I love the director. I really want to see more of her work, and like, and she's still like, this is still one of her first movies, so she has like so much more to do. And yeah, I really, really, really liked it, and I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's definitely a slow burner, so it's not one that like you can kind of like sit down and like expect to like feel the plot like moving forward. It's definitely kind of, because she's more of a neo-realist director, it definitely feels kind of like a normal day and almost like slowly moving like that. But what I love about the film is just like it tackles these very controversial issues like reproductive rights and abortion and sexual harassment, but it doesn't do it in like an overly like preachy self-righteous way. It's more just like kind of giving you the story, and then you have to kind of infer the different like implications of these scenes. So it's beautifully done, but definitely not a movie for all people, I would say.
So, with our discussion of our favorite movies and shows out of the way, we're going to move into some of our, or go into sort of like a recap, I guess, of some of the most important news that happened. So, because of the pandemic, studios like Universal and Warner Brothers have decided to put their content on streaming. This started a new trend which gradually shortened the theatrical window, which is the amount of time between a film's release in theaters and its release on video. Normally, the theatrical window is 90 days, but after the success of Trolls World Tour on streaming, Universal reached a deal with AMC that shortened the theatrical window to 17 days. This process was further accelerated by HBO Max's announcement that they are going to put Warner Brothers' entire 2021 slate on the streaming service. The movies affected include some high-profile projects like Matrix 4, The Suicide Squad, and, of course, Dune. These movies will be released in theaters, but also on HBO Max on the same day. The move will eliminate the theatrical window, at least for Warner Brothers movies in 2021. So it's been pretty controversial. It's had some backlash from theater owners who believe that this threatens the theatrical model, and some production partners like Legendary Pictures and talents like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve have voiced their dissatisfaction with the decision. Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve both found out about it the day after through news, so they were sort of left out of the loop. Pre-pandemic, the theatrical window provides bonuses linked to theatrical box office returns to talents. Warner Brothers reached a deal with the talents behind Wonder Woman 1984, namely Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot, giving them the bonuses based on the assumption that the film will make $1 billion dollars at the box office. They did not seem to reach deals with other talents and partners. So one of the biggest films that this whole news affects is Dune. It was believed to be Warner Brothers' answer to Star Wars. It was sort of going to, start off a new franchise for them. And it was the movie people thought was going to save theaters post pandemic. Then it got delayed from December to next year, or I guess this year, October. And many worried that Dune moving to HBO Max could signify an end to theaters. So, with that said, a recent report has indicated that Legendary Pictures, who financed about 75% of Dune, was intending to sue Warner Brothers. And so this may change Warner Brothers' mind. The development may mean that Dune could become a theatrical movie. So, with all these recent developments, it raises a lot of questions about what the future of streaming and movie theaters will be, what their relationship will be in the future, and how that's going to affect the type of content that's going to be produced. So, with all that background info out of the way, I'd like to hear your own opinions on where you think streaming is headed, where you think movie theaters will be doing in this next year, specifically with how it deals with the HBO Max deal. And what do you think this means for Dune and other movies like it, which could be released on streaming?
Yes. So I think there's a lot of debate on the streaming with HBO Max, with studios and theaters, and there's a lot of debate about who's right or who's wrong. You know, some people support the studios. They think that the studios should release the movie on streaming for the audiences, and because the studios are running short of money if they don't put these movies out to people and start making some revenue. But some people are also sympathetic towards the theaters because they feel like the movie studios will destroy the theatrical model and make theaters gone forever. I think I do see points from both sides. I think that studios like Warner Brothers and Universal, I think they made a wise decision to put some of their movies on streaming because these movies can't just stay on the slate forever and be delayed further and further. And given how uncertain the pandemic is, I think the studios needed a way to survive in the pandemic and start making some money instead of losing money, because studios losing money is always bad because we need these studios to make these quality contents that we see every single week, whether on our TV or on movies. I am also sympathetic towards the theaters though, because I've always believed that movies are a theatrical experience. I enjoy watching movies with audiences worldwide sometimes in a little dark room where everybody just enjoys the same thing at the same time, no matter which background you're from. So it will be very sad just for my own sake to see theaters going away. But it is undeniable that streaming is going to be the future. Do I think streaming is going to completely destroy movie theaters, that movie theaters are going to be gone for good? I do not think so. I think movie theaters are still going to exist. But like we have discussed by ourselves before, I think movie theaters are going to become a very sort of specialty product where it only shows a certain type of movie, kind of like how football stadiums are only for those big leagues games. Like, for example, movies like the Marvel movies are going to save cinema in the sense that they're going to make sure the cinemas are still here, but we're going to see a very limited portfolio of movies going to movie theaters. You're going to see a lot more sort of indie films or more less action focused, less CGI films going on to streaming. I think at one point for a lot of filmmakers, I think that could be a little bit of a terrible news, especially for a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve, who are ardent supporters of the theatrical model and who made movies dreaming that their movies can go onto the movie theaters. And I think for newcomers, that could be a bit of a discouraging news as well, because if you're a filmmaker, you would definitely want to see your movie going on the big screen rather than having someone watch it on their iPhones. But I also think it gives studios more chance to be risky with their streaming movies, especially with this whole new revenue model with streaming, given how much revenue that Netflix is bringing in every single year. And I think for a lot of new filmmakers, given how selective and competitive Hollywood is, it may shift the dynamics a little bit, bring a more diverse, younger generation of filmmakers who have more opportunities to express their opinions, to express their backgrounds in film. So I think streaming, I think it has a bright future. It's going to hurt us a little bit in the short term, but I think the long term, I think it will make everyone happy.
Denis Villeneuve talked into his he wrote like an op-ed afterwards, and that changed my mind, because before that I thought that, well, if it's moving to streaming, like, you know, why is that a big deal? But, you know, he was explaining that, well, it's because of the cost of movies like Dune. So, you know, and Denis Villeneuve is one of those directors that works with a large budget but still manages to create a very artful, you know, piece of like media. And so I'm wondering what that means for high budget but also sort of artful productions in the future, because they might not be, like, studios might not be willing to take a risk on something like that in the future. and that could be a shame.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's going to depend sort of individually on the business model of whatever production company we're working with. Because, for example, I think looking at all the news that came out at the Disney Investors Day about the Disney Plus deal and the future of Marvel and Star Wars properties, they've made a point to purposely separate what's going to be on their streaming services and what is, I'm assume at least as long as the pandemic sort of goes according to plan, what will eventually go back to theaters. Because I don't think that Disney would be willing to sacrifice like a theater release for something like a major Star Wars film versus like a Disney Plus show. So I think there's definitely a future for movie theaters with a certain types of films.
I completely agree with Olivia. I think the Disney Investors Day gave us a lot of new perspectives on how to look at the industry. There's still a lot of big blockbusters, high profile movies that are still going to be theatrical on Disney's end. And I think that probably means that these big movies are still going to be in theaters. Because remember, 2019 was probably the best year for blockbusters. Disney had 6 or 7 films that broke $1 billion. Avengers Endgame became the highest grossing movie of all time. And then Warner Brothers, Universal Studios also thrived. They made a lot of successful films during the past few years. And I think with streaming, you just can't replicate that kind of success with $1 billion per movie. So I do think that studios are aware of that. And I think they're going to diversify their portfolio. Like, for example, DC's spokesperson, Walter Hamada, said the other day that they were going to have 4 theatrical movies and then 2 streaming movies going into productions for every single year. Now, we don't know how good these movies are going to be because obviously they haven't came out, so we can't judge. But one thing that I'm certain about is that the winner of all of these will be us as audiences, because we'll have a more diversified movie viewing experience with, we can watch our favorite things happening at our home and in theaters at the same time. Like, for example, this year, the MCU is putting out 6 shows and 4 movies. We basically, starting from January 15, we have 1 new MCU content every week. As a fan, that makes me extremely happy.
What you said, Harry, is very important because from a fan perspective, from a movie watcher perspective, it's good news because, you know, you don't go to the movie theater for every movie, but now if more are released on streaming, you can watch them more easily at home or whatever. But as like from a filmmaker's perspective or a future, you know, hopeful filmmaker, it is kind of disappointing that if the theater becomes limited to just a few movies, like everyone kind of dreams of having their movie on the big screen and not, you know, on someone's laptop. So, and also like you said, that like some filmmakers like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve and like Marvel movies, those are the types of movies that are like, they deserve to be on the big screen. Like, I think it doesn't really do them justice if you're watching them on a small screen. So I don't know. I think maybe not releasing, uh, maybe not relegating movies just to streaming, but kind of like what they did for Wonder Woman 1984, like maybe having theater and streaming release, or like a slightly delayed streaming release is the best option for now, but it's tough.
Yeah, and that actually segues into sort of one of the questions I wanted to ask you guys, which is, you know, there's a lot of us are filmmakers, a lot of us are aspiring filmmakers. As like a filmmaker, how would you feel about like a movie that you made or something that you make going to streaming as opposed to cinema? Like, would that be fine with you? Like, is that, you know, is that the same thing in your opinion, or does it lose, like, does the movie itself lose something by going to streaming?
I mean, I honestly think it depends on like what type of filmmaker you are. I think definitely for like Christopher Nolan, who's used to like having these like big budget films and like having them um be this like theatrical experience, I think that's when like you definitely have kind of this sense of disappointment when it goes directly to streaming. But then you have a lot of these other filmmakers who are used to like lower budgets and are used to like maybe just like circulating their films in the festival, in the like different festivals before it goes directly to streaming. And a lot of them are happy with that because when it goes to streaming, it can reach a like a more a wider audience and even like across the world. And so I was actually reading a Barry Jenkins interview with the cast of Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, and they were talking about how like the film, it had only been able to get its like theatrical appearance at Sundance and Berlin, and then it went directly to streaming. And he was kind of talking about how with Moonlight, he was actually really excited when it went to streaming, because a lot of people came and told him like they were afraid of going to see it in the theater because they were afraid of like being associated with the themes that the movie talked about, like being homosexual themselves, or like, I don't know, seeing people they knew there and like being associated with that film. And so by having it released on streaming, they were more comfortable watching this film and engaging with it. And so I think with a lot of those kinds of films, releasing it to streaming, while it may not be the same experience, it's able to reach a lot more people and have them like actually engage with the material and really experience it. And so I think like there's kind of two sides to this, and that like I think for a lot of like smaller budget films, it's actually preferable because they're reaching a wider amount of people and really getting their message across the world. But then I definitely understand like the sense of disappointment that filmmakers who kind of have dreamed of this life of having their movie on this big screen and having people engage with it and like this movie experience, I can understand the sense of disappointment there.
I think to bring a little bit of optimism for filmmakers, I think we can consider the international market for a little bit, because streaming is right now only sort of like a US thing, that in the US we're kind of putting movies on streaming, but in another market like China, movies are still very much theatrical where people enjoy them in the theaters. So I think for a lot of filmmakers, even if your film goes to streaming in the US, there's still a pretty good chance that your film may play in theaters in China for worldwide audiences to enjoy. And I think that the ideal world would be what Disney and Warner Brothers are trying to do right now, is that they're not saying that, I think at least for Warner Brothers, although they're putting their 2021 slate onto streaming, I think from what I've been hearing from the DC side of things at the very least, I think their plan is not to take the existing theatrical movies and switch them to streaming, but rather expand their portfolio, expand their movie slate by saying we're going to make more movies, we're going to make more risk-taking movies, and make those fit tailored for streaming. So these movies are never going theatrical in the first place. And I think for filmmakers, that's great news, because making a movie on streaming is better than having no chance to make any movie at all. And like you said, Kate, streaming does reach more audiences because they can just sit at the comfort of their homes and watching all the movies, and they still talk about these movies the same as they talk about the theatrical movie. Like everybody was talking about The Mandalorian season 2, despite that being just a streaming show. So I think for filmmakers, I don't blame anyone if they feel like they need a bit of time to adjust to. I think we all went into a film profession wanting to see our film be in theaters. But I also think that there could be potentially a lot of really great opportunities out there, and for us to make more diverse kind of films. Like there are streaming films and there are theatrical films, and we can probably make both. And I think eventually, I think everyone will be happy.
Yeah, and I think that raises a really good point, because I think maybe the more important relationship, rather than like director, like filmmaker, movie theater, is just like filmmaker and like the audience. As long as you can reach an audience that really connects with your film at an emotional level, whether it's through streaming or whether it's through a movie theater, I think that's ultimately like the more important thing. So it can definitely help for that. And I've seen sort of like, I guess maybe like an indie revival in the past like maybe decade or so, where there's a lot of smaller films that get a lot of attention from people, just because people are really craving that type of film. Because movie theaters right now, for the past 10 years there hasn't really been a lot of, I guess, smaller indie films. But on streaming there's a lot of, like, whether it's shows or whether it's smaller movies, there's a lot of content on streaming to really like satisfy that niche.
No, yeah, because it's kind of like that thing that in streaming, these filmmakers can take more risk and be more creative. And really in streaming is where I can see like these low budget indie movies, like, again, bring up Never Really Sometimes Again. Like, I think I really wouldn't have watched that movie without like this year, like with like pandemic and everything. I probably would have watched more of the hype movies, from like Dune to like The French Dispatch and stuff like that. But then like this year, really most of the movies and most of my favorite movies were really like those low budget, like small movies that I got to see through streaming. And those were like the biggest movies of like this year. Like if you just like look at like the top movies or like most critically acclaimed movies of this year, it was really those like small indie movies that found their way through streaming, and actually like this situation has actually helped them, because really they're like the ones that are getting like the most attention right now. And yeah, these directors are just getting more of a chance to be creative, not being tied down by producers. Like streaming is like less risky, so you can actually just be more risky like with your films and with your vision. So for as a film goer, I'm excited for streaming because I get to see like more directors like being creative. So yeah, I'm actually excited for that as like streaming.
Yeah, and to add on to that, like I'm also really excited by the opportunities it's given to international filmmakers. I think that this year especially we've seen kind of a newer appreciation, or over the last couple of years, a newer appreciation for international filmmakers and a kind of renewed um, interest in those films that they're bringing to the US. I think with kind of the lack of movies in theaters this year, there hasn't really been the opportunity for these big budget Hollywood films to kind of overshadow all of these movies coming in from across the world. And so definitely I think streaming has allowed for these wonderful movies that probably in normal years wouldn't be taken seriously as like really great films because they're not from the US. I think that streaming has given them a platform to reach US audiences and for the US to actually take them seriously as quality films, which is really exciting for me as a lover of international film.
Speaking of international films, I do have a question that I wanted to ask everyone's opinions on. So we've seen, like Kate said, a newfound appreciation for international films and definitely a growth of them. I think the two examples that are in my mind right now is first, Parasite became the first non-English speaking film that won Best Picture at the Oscars, which meant a lot not only to Asian cinema, but also to international cinema. And also this year, due to the pandemic, the worldwide box office #1 of the year was a Chinese film. So how do we think that's do we think that's just a one-time thing with the pandemic, given how weak Hollywood was this year because of the pandemic? Or do we think this has a long-term impact in the film industry? And given how much Hollywood and China are kind of intersecting with one another, how the two industries have really crossed over a lot in a lot of different movies, do we think that relationship is going to strengthen in the future, or do we think there are certain problems that may come with this?
I think with Parasite, what that really helped was like open the eye for like Korean cinema, which is really cool, and it's been really strong for decades now, and so that I think for Korean cinema is an amazing thing because now people realize that there's other movies besides movies that are made in the U.S. that are amazing for film buffs and people who really like cinema. And I hope that there's more movies like that from around the world that sort of open people's eyes to the emergence of international film. But I don't know, like it might still take like a while to catch on, I guess.
Yeah, I do sort of agree that it might take a while to sort of catch on with all the mainstream audience in America, but I do think that it's got legs as an idea because I think it's important to latch on to the optimistic qualities that like streaming has to offer. Because I mean, as a filmmaker, you can think of it as, oh, like I wanted my movie to be seen on the big screen, not somebody's iPhone. But I think there's a certain intimacy to the way you engage with media when it's like on a smaller screen or when you're not in a room with full of a dozen people. I mean, you'll never have to worry about being in a theater again and some random kid like talking while you're trying to enjoy the movie. And even with like large scale films that you'd think you should be enjoying on the big screen, like Christopher Nolan films, I mean, like you have subtitles at home, so you can probably better engage with the film at home than you can on the big screen anyway. So
Plus, with Chris Nolan films, I feel like a lot of the time subtitles are needed.
And I think too, like what we saw a couple years ago with Roma was the fact that like there was a lot of like critical acclaim for this film that was released on a streaming service. Like it still was an incredible film. It was international. It was released on streaming and yet it still like made a profound impact on cinema. And so I think like what that showed us and what also Parasite showed us is that there's a path clear, like they're clearing the path for international cinema right now. And I think it might be a gradual process, but I think streaming will definitely help with that, as we saw with Roma. And I think what we'll see in the future.
I think even with just TV shows, like Money Heist is one of the biggest shows right now. And I think it's really like, I think one of like the only like international shows that like mainstream audiences watch, and it's from Spain. And so yeah, just like with TV shows, like people are just like seeing more international shows that are being put in Netflix and HBO Max. And I think just like with streaming, the people are watching more like international movies, it's because it's like not as risky to like, oh, let me go to the movie theater, pay this much money and watch this thing that's kind of risky for my taste. But then if you're like at the comfort of your own home and you're just kind of like, okay, let me just put this on, let me see what I think. So I think like by having it in streaming, people like can take more risk with just like the type of shows that they want to watch, because it's just like, oh, if I don't like it, I'll turn it off and I'll put something else. But in the movie theater, you could say you like wasted your time, you wasted your money. So streaming can also just make you, as a film goer, just like be more risky and like try more things and like diversify like your films and TV shows. But yeah, I definitely think streaming is helping a lot, like the international movies and TV shows.
So I see that as an audience perspective, we're very much in favor of this whole international trend. I wanted to ask an interesting question to everyone. So we all know that the Mulan movie came out this year, and Disney really wanted to appeal to Chinese audiences and international audiences by making a movie about a different culture. But unfortunately, in China, it didn't turn out so well. I don't think the movie was the success that they at least envisioned in China, both critically and financially. So I guess thinking from a perspective of a Hollywood executive, like if you were an executive at Disney, given everything you've seen this year, what do you think is like, what would be your advice to your studio or your company coming into 2021 and beyond about how to best appeal to the foreign market, especially, the Chinese market, which is so integral to Hollywood these days? I guess if everyone needs a bit of time to think, I can probably talk about a little bit about my experience as both a Chinese and an American. I think it's interesting how I had these different perspectives. I think through my observations of foreign markets, I think that there are really more commonalities between global audiences that we previously thought. Like we previously thought that foreign audiences, for example, Chinese audiences, are completely different from American audiences, that the companies need to somehow specially appeal to them in order to make them like the movie. But I think one thing that we need to realize, from at least in my own opinion, is that I think no matter where you're from, obviously there are differences in taste, there are differences in cultures, but I think everyone likes a good movie. Like, for example, Parasite is a Korean movie made from a Korean perspective. I don't think when Bong Joon-ho made that movie, he was like, I'm going to appeal to the American audiences, I'm going to appeal to the Oscar judges. But everyone in America seemed to have loved that movie. And I think a good movie is universally loved. I think the only thing about appealing is that sometimes Hollywood makes a lot of assumptions about other cultures. Like there are always these stereotypes, not just with other cultures, but also with different groups, different groups of people, that they assume what these people are, assume what they like. And I think that Hollywood should probably do a bit less assumption coming to 2021, really take the time to understand what is going on in different cultures. And I really think that don't try so hard to appeal to a certain audience because you feel that they're different from you. I think sometimes the harder you try, the more ineffective the strategy will be. I think just in the culture perspective, just respect the culture. I think that should be more than enough to make them like the movie. For example, Avengers Endgame is still a very American-centric film. That film was immensely successful all over the world because it was just a good film that everyone was able to connect to. So that would be my advice if I was a Hollywood executive.
Yeah, I think maybe like you said, the more important thing might be like instead of like just appealing to like a wider audience, is just to like have a more diverse group of people making films and like funding new and different projects that people want to do. And I think naturally from that you'll just get a huge variety of different opinions and different ideas, because people have hugely varying like I guess interpretations of like what cinema is, how to make a good movie. And if you just allow those projects to be funded, I think streaming is one of those ways that you can sort of allow a whole bunch of different diverse people to make their projects. Naturally through that, you'll appeal to a much wider demographic.
For sure, yeah. I really do think that I really agree with what you said, that in front of the camera, behind the camera, we need more diversity. And I think that's something that Hollywood realizes that they need to improve upon. And I'm glad to see that there's more diversity, but we also have to push for even more diversity. And I think as you're behind the camera talent, as you're in front of the camera talent, as these executives, these producers, these decision makers become more and more diverse, I think the key to sort of how to unlock the film market, I think that's automatically unlocked. I think the studios will automatically understand how to appeal to different kinds of audiences. And I think the streaming could be a very interesting start to that, because like we said, streaming can invite a diverse range of filmmakers into filmmaking.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot of the time studios and a lot of people in Hollywood try to supplement a lack of connection with a culture or a lack of knowledge with a sort of like pandering mindset about how we're going to like make sure that this piece of media appeals to a certain group of people. But I think if you work from a position of simply respecting the culture, even if you're not a part of it, or like seeking the diversity behind the camera that you need, then you're naturally going to be able to appeal to more people and make better products.
Yeah, and that can segue into our next conversation, since we sort of tied up the streaming conversation about the Oscars' new diversity rules, and sort of just to go into like a brief review of what those are. There's multiple standards, so there's like standard A, standard B, standard C, and standard D for film companies and for film production companies in order to submit to the Oscars, and in order for it to win Best Picture, I'm pretty sure. So at least one actor from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group must be cast in a significant role. The story must center around women, LGBTQ per people, a racial or ethnic group, or the disabled, and at least 30% of the cast must be actors from at least two of these four underrepresented categories for standard A. And then there's multiple standards down there. Standard B is more for hiring. So for two or more department heads, meaning jobs like director, cinematographer, composer, must be female, LGBTQ, disabled, or part of an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. At least 6 other crew members must be from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group, and at least 30% of the film's crew must hail from the 4 underrepresented groups continually laid out in these guidelines. And then further standards down the line. And I guess one of the most, important questions is like, do we think this is going to actually change like how the Oscars is run? Like, do we think that this is going to have significant change for, improving diversity? And in terms of like where the Oscars stands in terms of it being, like the say all and end all for like the movie opinion in the US at least, like what that is going to do for the Oscars.
I would like to start off by saying that I think this is a good policy. I think Hollywood needs a lot of diversity. I think the reason why they had these requirements is because Hollywood is so lacking in diversity. Maybe until like just recent years when they started to have a little bit of a more diverse portfolio of movies with more diverse people working on it. I think that a good movie, how to judge a good movie, in my mind, is always that how well the movie speaks to you as an audience member, because it's an experience that you have with others, yes, but there's also a personal relationship with you and the movie. And if your movie is not diverse enough, if your movie does not speak to everyone, then I wouldn't say that's a good movie. If your audiences feel excluded, if they feel that I don't matter, or the group that I represent don't matter in this movie. So I think this is a good policy. But one thing that I'm afraid of is that I don't want this to be the end goal where Hollywood thinks this is good enough and let's just stop here because we need to fulfill these requirements. Because the ultimate goal is that even without these requirements, studios will still hire diverse groups of people. Not just that we're just going to hire this group of people because we think that they're the best at their job, but rather opening up their eyes, accepting different perspectives. So I think this is a good start, but by no means is this an end. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I'm glad that at least from the Oscars level, they're realizing that this is a problem. Is this the best solution to end all kinds of problems in Hollywood? Absolutely not. But is it an attempt, a good hearted attempt at solving a problem? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely think this is a good hard attempt. And the Oscars just recently has suffered a lot of criticism because of this. We've gotten like the Oscars so white movement, where there were many years where no black actors or directors were nominated like for the whole year. There's a lot of controversy with like, I think there was one year where Greta Gerwig wasn't nominated for director category, and really like there's been barely any like women nominated for the director category in the Oscars. So this is just kind of like a response to it, and I definitely think it is a step forward. But I guess like you explained, like we shouldn't just be hiring and having more diversity just to be able to be nominated for an Oscar. Like this is just like something that we have to do to bring more stories, to have more representation. And I think this could maybe bring a change, but honestly, really the movies that will pay attention to this will be like these big movies from big directors, or movies that are like Oscar baity that really want this Oscar. Definitely like, I don't know if like big blockbuster movies or movies that that are just like good popcorn movies will really follow this standard. So definitely there has to be a more change in Hollywood as well. I feel like this will really, the movies and studios that will pay attention to this will be those movies that are like intended to be made for an Oscar, or they know they're good, they have this story, this director, this cast. So this will really only focus on those movies, and then there might be a change, or maybe it will inspire just Hollywood as a whole to kind of take this standard. But yeah, I definitely think it's a step forward. Still not sure how much it will change, but yeah, definitely a good step forward.
Yeah, I completely agree about that. I think that it's important that they made these new diversity rules because it finally acknowledges kind of that they are taking this seriously, that diversity is going to become something that Hollywood focuses on more in the future. I personally don't think a whole lot will change, just because standards C and D are more focused on like the film distributors and how like they need to hire like maybe 2 interns from an underrepresented background for standard C, and then standard D is like publicity and marketing should be a certain percentage of like underrepresented populations, which are things that a lot of these studios already fulfill. And so because of that, the standards A and standards B, which are kind of the more important ones for diversity, a lot of people are thinking that those won't actually be met in the future. And so because of that, I don't think a whole lot will change, but it is important that they made these new rules because it's kind of showing for the first time, like, yes, Hollywood is taking this seriously. And for me, I am actually very excited by standard B in particular, because I think obviously like actors and actresses are very visible to audiences. We see them on the screen. We know how much of a population of an underrepresented population is in a movie because we can see it with our own eyes. But I think what a lot of people forget about are the people behind the scenes, the people, the cinematographers, the composers, producers, directors, all of that people tend to forget about a lot. And so like cinematography, which is one field I'm like very interested in particular, I think is only about 4% female, and no female cinematographer has ever been nominated, much less win an Oscar. And so I think it's very important that they're finally, for the first time with standard B, kind of saying like, we need to start paying attention to the people who are behind the camera, because even though like a story might focus on an underrepresented population, like who is making the film? Is it the white Hollywood men who have been making these stories for so long, or is it the actual people who are familiar with this story, who know the nuances of that plotline? And so I think that it's exciting for me to see that they are kind of, for the first time, thinking about standard B and thinking about having more people behind the camera that are familiar with the topic.
I remember when these guidelines first came out, I was always sort of torn as to the motivation behind them, about whether, this was really just in response to backlash, where they really were trying to like take this seriously and address it as a problem in Hollywood. But I do think, as Kate was saying, that standard B really does excite me, that they're taking it seriously enough where they recognize that behind the camera diversity is as influential as simply putting more diverse people in front of the camera. And I do think, even though that issues of prejudice are really about hearts and minds, there is a systematized issue in Hollywood. And I think trying to address that in a sort of systematized way with these standards is a step in the right direction.
I think one thing we have to realize is that we as audiences have a lot of power and responsibility in all of this. I wrote a paper about the lack of diversity in Hollywood, kind of focusing on the lack of Asian characters or positive Asian roles. But I think this applies to a lot of other underrepresented groups as well. And I think for so long, we see a lot of stereotypical portrayals or lack of portrayals in movies. And we were told to not be so sensitive of these issues. We were told to enjoy the movie for what it is rather than its political messaging. Like, for example, when Once Upon a Time in Hollywood came out, there was a Bruce Lee scene that portrayed him as this basically arrogant idiot. And it was an extremely stereotypical and condescending portrayal of Asians. And we were kind of just told on social media that, oh, it was just a joke. You need to learn to take that joke. But I think as audiences, if you're uncomfortable with something, if you feel like something makes you unhappy, I think it is your responsibility to speak out to studios, because the unfortunate fact about Hollywood is that money talks in Hollywood, and they won't make a change unless you somehow adjust their financial model. And the financial model comes from us as audiences, that if we can exert that credible threat of not watching that movie if they make stereotypical portrayals, then they're going to start changing the direction. That's the exact same way why the Oscar added this diversity rule. I have a feeling that is more because of the backlash rather than a couple of good-hearted people saying, oh, we got to make a change, because that's never enough in Hollywood unless you somehow bring money into all of this. So I think as audiences, we got to take more responsibility for what we're doing, for what movies we're seeing, and for using social media to talk about movies in a way that is culturally meaningful.
Yeah, and I think maybe something to consider is that like the actual voting block for the Oscars doesn't seem to have changed that much. So the voting block is the Academy of Motion Pictures and Arts and Sciences, and I don't think, I'm trying to find if they have like any if they're trying to meet like diversity quotas themselves. But if they haven't really changed, then it's largely the same people who have been voting in the Oscars for the past 100 years or so. So the Oscars may just not be like the place to go for relevant like film, like I guess commentary in the future. And that's sort of what people have been saying for the past like I guess 10 years or so, as we've seen sort of like a decline in Oscars ratings. People have stopped really watching the Oscars, stopped largely caring, I guess, about what the Oscars are doing. And maybe there'll be like newer and more like award shows that sort of are able to fit better into our time right now, with more diverse people actually running the show itself.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to another awesome episode of I Beg to Differ. Thank you, Gabe, and thank you to everyone else for contributing to this really meaningful and rich discussion. I personally have learned so much, and I wish our audiences learned a little bit more about movies and actually heard a bit about how us as Duke students view about movies' future in 2021 and beyond. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. And also like our Facebook page, like our Instagram page. And you can sign up for DIF and become part of it, and you have a chance to be on this very show. We'll see you on the next episode. Thank you so much, and have a happy new year.